Alright, I am Emily Buttry and I'm a graduate student at West Texas A&M working on a PhD. I'm also an extension assistant full-time for Dr. Ted McCullum, the livestock specialist for the Panhandle. We'll start with the 2008, so if you want to, some of this information's in here.
There's two handouts. One has this little icon down in the lower right. The other one has one in the center.
As Brent mentioned, we started this trial back in 2006, and so at that time, on the dry land to start with, well, actually on all the dry land, limited and full, 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre was applied and 90 pounds of phosphorus back in 2006. To kind of tell you where we started with. 2007, there was no additional fertilizer added. If we look at 2008, there was 60 pounds of nitrogen applied to all 3 irrigation treatments and 30 pounds of phosphorus applied to all. 2009, this year, is where we've gotten into some differences, and so 182 pounds of nitrogen applied to the dry land, and then on the limited and full, there's been 295 pounds of nitrogen applied so far this year. Phosphorus, there's been 80 pounds to all 3 irrigation treatments for this year. So for a total from 2006 through currently, 282 pounds of nitrogen on the dry land, 395 on the limited and full nitrogen, and then 200 pounds of phosphorus on dry, limited, and full. So that just tells you our fertilizer rates and where we're starting with as a base.
I might just mention real quick, we didn't want fertilizer to be a limiting factor here. So some of these may seem high, and the nitrogen probably is a little bit this year, but we didn't want it to be short. And we added this extra 60 pounds of nitrogen on late this last month, about 3 weeks ago, primarily because we were getting so much yellowing in this blue stem grass. So we felt like maybe we needed some. I'm not sure if we did, but that's why we put that extra 60 pounds on.
Alright guys, if we look at irrigation and rainfall, Brent described how we're applying and coming up with that irrigation amount. So in 2008, there was no additional irrigation water applied to the dry land. The limited received 7.33 inches and the full got 14.7 inches. That was from about June until September or late August. Rainfall for that time, June 9th through September 3rd, was 5.84 inches here at Etter. This year so far we've gotten 6 inches and 13/100ths. There was 0.72 inches applied to the dry land, and that was right after fertilizer was applied to help get that incorporated. 6.81 inches on the limited and almost 14 inches on the full so far this year. So that again sets up the water issue with us. Now we'll get into some data. So I've got each clipping. We did 4 clippings last year. We did 2 in July, 1 in August, and 1 in September. I don't have the individual month clippings for you here today, just the total for 2008. As we would expect, as irrigation level increased, yield increased. So the limited produced more than the dry land, the full produced more than the limited and the dry land. And we would expect that the more water, the more yield we're going to get. We look into, there was an interaction, so some grass species responded differently to different amounts of water. If we look at total yield on the full irrigation, the Spar Old World Blue Stem yielded the most over the whole season. And so this table's in your handout if you want to talk about specifics, but mainly I guess the issue here was some of the grasses responded differently. They all responded to water. And if you've got questions along the way, just ask them. All the nutrient data on these, we submitted the final clipping, so the September clipping is what we submitted for nutrient analysis. I'm just going to show you 2 of those variables today. The in vitro true digestibility, which is a percentage, and this tells us how digestible is that forage, specifically for cattle. Here we had, there was no interaction, water by grass interaction, and really they were pretty similar. I would say the highest in terms of digestibility was the switchgrass on full irrigation. But again, that's just a measure of how digestible and how useful will that be to cattle. We've got some lower numbers here, 69% with this buffalo grass. But again, all this is in the handout, and specific questions, just go ahead and let us know. We'll look at crude protein next, and this one was maybe with why we saw what we did. If we look at the crude protein, the highest level of crude protein was on dry land. Now I think that's probably because there was less yield, and so with less yield we can have higher nutrient amount. What's a little odd to me is that the second highest amount of crude protein was on the fully irrigated, and then it dropped back down with the limited. So I think maybe here we're getting into a maturity issue. After we've cut it with the full irrigation, it can maybe grow a little bit more. The limited got stunted somewhat and matured a little bit earlier. And Dr. Redmond, if I'm off base, let me know. But I've kind of struggled with why we saw that trend. But it makes sense with the dry land anyway for it to be the highest in crude protein amount. And from a cattle grazing standpoint, that's what we're concerned with, is the crude protein. It came out and harvested on June 1st of this year. And again, we've got a response to water. As we increase the amount of water, we increase yield, and that makes sense to us. There was also an interaction, so some of these grasses are going to respond differently to water. This Bermuda grass on dry land was pretty low yielding there on June 1st with 0.15 tons an acre compared to the switchgrass, 0.73 tons per acre on dry land. This just shows you some differences. Again, as we increase water, we're going to increase yield, which makes sense. We'll go to July 1st next.
One thing I do want to mention, the way we're harvesting these grasses, we're using this Carter harvester, and right here. And so, you make a good point, I think, about the growth habit of some of these grasses, and maybe we're not, harvesting all of that lower material. We do cut them pretty low, so I feel like we're getting most of the forage that's out there. We may be cutting a little bit too low in some cases. So I think we're getting most of the forage that's being produced with this forage harvester. Now this next cutting, we may very well not use the harvester. We may just do it by hand because we're getting stuff that's growing more prostrate rather than upright right now. So we may do it that way.
Alright, so when we go to July 1st in our harvest, again, looks like all the dry land was pretty low this time, when we especially compare it to June 1st. The dry land seemed to all kind of level off or even decrease again.
We had very little precipitation in May and June. I mean, just almost nothing. And we probably shouldn't have even tried to harvest the dry land. There was a little forage being produced.
Again, though, if we look at the fully irrigated and even the limited, the more water we get, the more production. Here we've got the Old World Blue Stem is the highest on full production, where we go back to June, it was pretty low on the fully irrigated. So here's where we get into some of those interactions of, they respond differently to water at different times. We look at August. So this was August 3rd that we came out and harvested. Some of these dry lands are coming on a little bit better now. The Bermuda grass is still not doing too well on dry land, but on fully irrigated it really came up. Again, the side oats grama is doing pretty well, but just changes again. I think here we did not have an interaction, if I remember correctly, and that's in your handout. So here it would just be a grass species and then a water response. And then I've got the total from June, July, and August. So total overall, I don't believe there was an interaction, but we did have a water response. So the fully irrigated yielded more than the limited, yielded more than the dry land. But here, for overall, this dry land Bermuda grass, pretty low. We only got 0.3 of a ton per acre off of it. 4.4 tons per acre on this side oats, fully irrigated. Again, all this is in your handouts. We'll do probably one more cutting, if I understand correctly, in September. And then we will get nutrient analysis on each cutting this year. Last year we only did it on the final one. This year we're going to look at each month, because that can change with each grass month to month, and that's really what I'm interested in is that nutrient analysis. So we'll have that for you as soon as this wraps up. here in September, October.